Let me go ahead and get started here. I'm Chip Hance. I am a 35-year veteran of the medical device industry, and I've been involved in trying to champion the early feasibility study initiative within the United States for, probably a decade now at this point. I am a board member of the Medical Device Innovation Consortium and champion this effort. This particular event, I am joining Dr. Adnan Siddiqui of Jacobs Institute for a session here to talk about the application of early feasibility studies to the neurovascular space. And Dr. Siddiqui was kind enough to think about that some outreach directly to the sponsor community of studies might be a good thing to do to facilitate some exploratory conversations. So we've gathered some speakers here, including Owen Ferris from FDA, Carlos Pena, who is at the Jacobs Institute, Eileen Mijas from MDIC, and Lauren Baker, who's a very active regulatory consultant in the space, all of which have a lot of experience in early feasibility studies from various different vantage points. And we thought that by gathering this group together for, call it 25 to 30 minutes of presentation, that we would be able to answer some questions very directly and have you, our audience, consider whether early feasibility study in the United States might be something that would be appropriate for novel therapies that are in your purview of development. So we're going to try and move the conversation along fairly quickly and get to our first speaker, Owen Ferris. But Adnan, do you want to make a quick comment too, by way of intro?
Yeah. I'm a neurosurgeon, and most of you, many of you, know me, very engaged in clinical trials and early technology, early feasibility. And I was recently in Marseille with my friend Carlos Pena, and it was just absolutely amazing as to how broken the MDR system is within Europe. And when we look at what's happening in the US, it is an absolute 180-degree difference. It doesn't mean that there is not work to be done or problems to be solved, but I think we have an incredible partner, incredible attitude at the FDA. And the goal of the MDIC is to bring all parties together, a not-for-profit organization with public and private partnerships, with sponsors, strategics, startups. They can all be part of MDIC, and Eileen can give you more information about that, but really to sort of facilitate this early technology adoption pathways in the United States. And I'm really delighted. I was just saying, for those who missed the very early part, that I just finished another first-in-man case right before this, thanks to the auspices of the FDA and the early feasibility program and Carlos Pena's leadership here at the JI. So love to share with you our thoughts, and we have Owen Ferris from the FDA as well with us. So I expect this to be educational, but more importantly, please do not be hesitant to pose questions either by chat or in person live. So with that, back to you, Chip.
Great. Thanks, Adnan. And again, we're going to encourage a lot of conversation, but let's bring up Owen's slides. And Owen, would you introduce yourself and take it away, please?
Sure. Thanks, Chip and Adnan. My name is Owen Ferris. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm the Principal Deputy Director in CDRH's Office of Product Evaluation and Quality, which is our office is about 2/3 of CDRH. We oversee all of the pre- and post-market decision-making. I've been at FDA about 20 years. In various roles, and have been very involved in clinical trials for many of those years. Next slide. I often like to start with our CDRH vision statement, which is that patients in the U.S. have access to high quality, safe and effective medical devices of public health importance, first in the world. And the reason I want to talk about it here is because, I think we're well known for the high quality, safe and effective part. The part where we've, really been on a journey, and EFS is a part of that, is the first in the world part. Stimulating innovation, bringing important products to patients that are shown to be safe and effective as quickly as possible. Next slide. And we've been on a journey in IDEs for the past dozen years or so, and this is just to show, a dozen or more years ago, people didn't really want to come to the FDA and to the US to conduct IDE clinical trials in many cases, and you can see why. The median time to approval of those trials was over 400 days. I was deeply involved in the efforts to take us to where we are today, and you can see for the past 9 years or so, our median time to IDE approval has been 30 days, which means that more than half of our IDEs are getting approved in the first review cycle, the first 30-day review cycle of an IDE. And I'm happy to talk more about how we got there and what that means. But I think it's been really ground-changing in terms of how folks view accessibility and the potential to conduct clinical trials in the US for medical devices. Next slide, please. And so just in a few days, we'll celebrate the 10th anniversary of the EFS guidance. I'm not going to belabor all of the potential values of EFS. I think I'd be preaching to the choir in this group, but it's pretty exciting to see the journey we've been on for the past 10 years. Next slide. And as you can see, the program has grown over the first few years of its existence and really has been in a relative steady state. I mean, obviously the pandemic may have had some impact as well over the past couple of years. But as you can see, we pretty consistently receive a fair number of EFS and approve a high proportion of those EFS studies. Next slide. And this is my last slide. A lot of the early work in the EFS space was in the cardiovascular area. That's my background as well. And as you can see, that has shifted. We have EFS in essentially every device area across CDRH. And in fact, last year, the most EFS we received was in the neuro area. And you can see that aligns pretty well with what we see with breakthrough designations as well, in terms of bringing innovative products to market through our breakthrough program. And so, EFS can be data that can help get a breakthrough designation. It can also be the first step in what the FDA and the company work on together under a breakthrough designation to develop that EFS. And with that, I think that's my last slide. You can just go to the next one just to make sure. Yep, so I'm done. Trying to follow your instructions, Chip, to move a little faster this time.
You're very kind. Thank you. Any questions for Owen? Here's your chance to chat to someone directly at FDA on this topic. While we're gathering questions, Owen, what's your thoughts on pursuing a breakthrough designation for novel technology? How would you describe that as complementary to doing an EFS, or do you need to do both in order to progress?
So no, you don't need to do both. And it really depends. I think, when we're looking for a breakthrough designation, when we're making a breakthrough designation determination, we're looking, as the guidance for breakthrough outlines, we're looking for credible potential that the device can make a real difference addressing an unmet need for a serious condition. The criteria are longer than that and more specific and are written in statute, but essentially we're looking for, credible potential that the device can make a difference. Sometimes that can be with non-clinical data. It can be with bench data. It can be sometimes with some animal data. It can be through literature at times. It can be through many other mechanisms other than clinical to demonstrate that credible potential. Sometimes it isn't enough. When we're making a breakthrough designation determination, we're trying to decide whether there's enough potential such that FDA and the company are going to roll up their sleeves and dedicate additional resources to really trying to speed the, bringing of that product through the regulatory pathway and bringing it to market. And sometimes preliminary clinical data are helpful in making that case. So we see it both ways. We see, sometimes some initial clinical data through something like EFS can be helpful in demonstrating that the breakthrough criteria are met. In other situations, the breakthrough criteria are met, and the first thing we roll up our sleeves and work on under breakthrough is designing an EFS if that is needed.
Gotcha.
So
go ahead, Adnan.
So I was thinking, Owen, about this sort of transformation, because really the party that led this were the cardiac division. This was really an initiative that began with really the founders at MDIC, with David Holmes and others, to really sort of spearhead this. Tell me a little bit about how other departments or offices at CDRH really sort of caught the bug, and what is sort of the mood in terms of, is there a real desire from the offices to leverage this mechanism? Is it a source of pride and joy, or is it just a mandate? Just more of an emotional context into how the FDA really approaches early feasibility compared to standard pivotal.
Yeah, I mean, I think it certainly did start in the cardiovascular space. We've been very intentional about spreading the learning. I think Andy Farb's going to join us a little later. He's in the cardiovascular space and is one of the, fathers of the EFS program. He's been really active. Others have been really active in sort of spreading the learning, sharing the value. We as I noted in my slides, count EFS. We look at, the numbers across different spaces. We try to encourage outreach and support and consideration of EFS, similar to, wanting to see the breakthrough program grow and stimulate innovation and innovative programs across CDRH. So I do think it's spreading. Neuro obviously has a lot of very innovative products that are ripe for EFS. And I think you can see that in the numbers that Neuro is every bit as active in innovative evaluation in the U.S. as cardiovascular is.
Great. Well, thank you, Owen. We may get back to you if you're still able to join us, but let's go to our next speaker, Carlos Pena. I think many of you knew Carlos, and I think we're going to work off of your slides, Carlos, if I'm not mistaken.
So Carlos Pena here. I am a Chief Regulatory Officer and Quality Officer at the Jacobs Institute. But in a past life, I was at the FDA as the Director for the Office of Neurophysical Medicine. So I have a slightly a different perspective now, being having worked at the Food and Drug and also being on the outside. And so I have like 3 best practices that I think are going to be helpful to folks that are interested in doing clinical studies here in the U.S. And for those that know me, this is a fun video of mine that I've put together. A lot of sponsors have questions about what to do on the road to medical device development. Do I have a device? They often sort of are confronted with, is it an adult one or a pediatric? And you see this sign here on the left, CMS, that's a little bit farther down the development path. But, one of the first stops or exits that I would encourage folks to take is to consider the pre-submission pathway. I think everyone's looking for a little bit more transparency, a little bit more regulatory clarity. And if sponsors and the Food and Drug Administration can come together, I think that's a big win, especially under this pre-submission pathway. And it's an opportunity to obtain FDA feedback. There is the option where you can either do an informational meeting or you can do a meeting with the FDA with specific questions, but it helps to clarify and get on the same page with the agency, which I think should happen before investments are made, before job decisions are made, before there is money spent. Because if you can do the right studies that the FDA is happy with, there's a higher probability success. And oftentimes folks would ask me, well, do I have to do this? And I would say, if your strategy doesn't include a pre-submission, it may not be a good strategy. So that's the first takeaway that I think is going to be important for especially sponsors of the neuro side to consider. Second takeaway is that many of the devices in the neuro space, and here's a nice panel that has a lot of different products, I think all of them at some point gathered some type of clinical performance data. And if they did, they probably started in what's the topic of today's session, the early feasibility study, where it's a small number of subjects, 15 or so, early in device development, and there is some flexibility in the system. I think the data that Owen shared with you on the earlier presentation on the IDE side of the house, where the numbers are quite striking with regard to standing up an IDE study, as well as the numbers for approval, show you the seriousness of the agency in working with companies to getting the studies up and running, to getting the data, to submitting the data, to getting the device to patients and physicians who desperately need them. You know, I'm a little bit biased. I think some of the hardest working folks in government are at the Food and Drug Administration. I'm a little biased. Some of the hardest working folks in the Office of Neuro are some of the hardest working at the FDA, and they're really willing to work with you to stand up these early feasibility studies, to bring those studies to the US. And there's a recent publication that FDA folks have authored just on this topic of EFS studies, where some of the data on the submission versus approval are shown, some of the data on decisions that some of the tricks that you can use in standing up these studies. I think it shows you how serious the staff are, and I would encourage folks to read the publication. So if you're considering to do a device development study, I would consider bringing on the US soil. The last thing is it resonates, I think, with the previous presentation that Owen gave about patients. He started off with the first slide. I'm going to end with the last slide. You know, I think there's this sometimes, you know, awkward dance that happens between sponsors and FDA staff that, you know, they're getting used to the new FDA. The FDA is still, you know, wanting to make the right decision based upon evidence. But I think if everyone recognizes it and makes it about the patient, is reminded about that at the beginning when the conversation begins, I think that's a great place to get a solid footing, a solid step of collaboration, especially in EFS between FDA and academia, industry, the private sector. And if you can make it about the patients, I think everyone's sort of in a better place. And I'm going to stop there, Chip.
Great. Good. Let's go full screen and see if there's some questions from the audience here. Anybody want to add into the chat group, or you know, feel free to unmute and ask a question. While we're looking for that, Carlos, talk a little bit about what you've seen directly at the Jacobs Institute. So you've now been close to a couple early feasibility studies, and what have you noticed that works well or works less well in what you've observed so far, very hands-on?
Yeah, so I think what works well is if there is an opportunity for more earlier discussions along the pre-submission process, or even I think a couple of times I've recommended folks to reach out directly to the agency to start a dialogue. That earlier interaction sometimes can avoid you know, sometimes where data sets are not perfect and you have less of a you know, more challenging data set after the study is done. But the earlier discussions have helped a lot. I think what people don't realize is that the agency is approachable, and I think people are getting used to the new FDA. That's going to take a little bit more time. Same goes for, I think, FDA staff. They're sort of still you know, wanting to make the right decision. So there's this dance that happens. I think that if people can come together a little bit more directly, be a little bit more open, I think that will also benefit the ecosystem.
Great. And what's your direct experience now? How many studies, EFS studies have, where Jacobs Institute's been a site?
Yeah, so in Buffalo, we've had several. I think Jacobs Institute works collaboratively with the hospital here as well as the University of Buffalo, and we have definitely more than 5, I would say upwards of 8 in various stages of progress.
Great, good.
One other question.
Yeah.
I don't know if Carlos or Owen, both of you can maybe opine on this before we go to our next speaker, and that is the transition. So early feasibility is all well and good, but it doesn't get you a label. It doesn't get you an approval. It's part of a process. And so can you share the value of doing an early feasibility compared to going a traditional pivotal route for devices that require clinical data? Obviously, we're not talking about non-clinical requiring data, but high-risk devices. What is the value proposition of early feasibility from your 2 perspectives? So Owen first, and then Carlos would be great.
Sure. I mean, I think there's, and Carlos and I may end up saying some of the same things. I think there's a lot of value in, we know that if you do an early feasibility study, lots of people in the US ecosystem, including FDA, start getting familiar with the device, right? You start having centers that are familiar with the device. You have FDA reviewers that are familiar with the device. You can start thinking much earlier on about what a future pivotal study might look like. You can start planning, months and sometimes, years in advance about certain testing that might be needed. We're not, whereas if you start with if the first time we're having the conversation with FDA is for the pivotal study, that's fine, it can work. But a lot of times you're then starting the education process and you're answering fundamental questions that could be much better answered earlier on, so that by the time you hit traditional feasibility or pivotal study, a lot of that is ready to go. We already know what we're doing. It comes in, we're expecting it, we understand the fundamentals of the product, and we can really hit the ground running.
Yeah, I think Owen said it very nicely. The discussion maybe can be a lot more bracketed around what is really possible with regard to safety concerns or safety, and where you should then hone your effectiveness endpoints and assessments. I think that gives a better sharpening of the study that's going to be the basis for a marketing submission.
Yeah, so
and the same is probably true for the clinical sites as well, right? So if you started with a handful, 1 or 2 sites in the US that have gotten some familiarity with the product, even if it's an earlier version in EFS, like that's going to help you get started and launch the more definitive trial.
right. And so as an extension of that question, can you foresee that while an EFS is going on, after you've done a few cases and gotten some experience, you could actually start talking about a pivotal design process contemporaneously? Because many people have I think the misimpression that you got to finish the EFS, submit everything, and then you got to come back down the road for a pivotal. That it can be contemporaneous. Can you clarify that?
Sure, for sure. I think a lot of times it depends. Sometimes it may be EFS and then a larger traditional feasibility study, depending on what's needed, what questions are outstanding. What do you need information to design that pivotal study that's going to come out of some of those earlier clinical evaluations. But there's absolutely, there's no hard rule that we need to finish one stage before we can start discussions on the next. We should be in communication all along the way. And I think, a pre-submission, particularly for some of these products where, it may take months to get those 5 patients that you're trying to do in your EFS, depending on who those patients are and the condition they have and, all of the other issues there. And if that time can also be used in parallel to have, say, pre-submission discussion about a future pivotal study, all the better.
Why don't we move on to our next 2 speakers? I think we'll do Eileen and Lauren back to back just to honor Lauren's time. But So Eileen, if you can bring up your slides, I just add to the conversation, having sort of observed a lot of these cardiovascular studies, and we might even try at MDIC, try and get a couple examples, but there's no doubt that I think the data would suggest that your three EFS sites are quite typically the first enrollers in your pivotal, and probably among your highest enrollers in the pivotal study. And you can start talking about shaving, 1 month, 2 months, 3 months with your faster enrollment in your pivotal, which can be worth, millions of dollars in cost to a company. So I think we might, now with as much cardiovascular history, see if we can't even take a stab at documenting what that, value proposition very quantitatively is. But I'll stop talking. Eileen Mias, program director for MDIC, working on trying to collaborate the community on feasibility studies.
Hi, everybody. I just want to give a little bit of a brief background on MDIC. So we are a public-private partnership, and the sole objective of MDIC is advancing regulatory science of medical devices for patient benefit. And we have 75 plus members, over 800 subject matter experts, and 70 plus resources that we have created over the years. And I'll give the link to the specific EFS resources at the end of the presentation. But this first slide actually goes over what Adnan was asking Owen and Carlos, and just reiterating what the benefit is to both the clinical research sites and our industry partners. And to piggyback off Carlos, it really is focusing on the patient is of utmost importance. And EFS really does offer access to groundbreaking medical technologies to have shared decision-making with your physician of these innovative, first of their kind innovations. And it also is going to help enable the clinical research sites to gain early access to the medical devices, fostering growth of their clinical research site programs. And then it also is going to help with familiarizing the clinical sites with both the devices, the procedures, enhancing the understanding and readiness, and engaging in that relationship with the sponsors, fostering collaboration and mutual understanding to have an easy transition into your pivotal IDE. And then it also, by conducting your EFS in the US, industry partners can reduce challenges and costs associated with OUS and work in conjunction while doing OUS trials as well as EFS in the US. And we're also aligning with regulatory timelines of US clinical sites and maintaining competitiveness compared to some of the overseas sites. And again, just to reiterate, one of the most important aspects for industry partners is engaging with the FDA in early and frequent communication. And this is going to facilitate smoother negotiations while planning your pivotal trial. And one of the working groups that we're currently working on, which we're going to kick off in November, is our EFS Champions Clinical Site Network. And what we plan on doing is working on the pain points at the site level to ensure EFS success. And this is going to include both experienced sites, and we want inexperienced sites of all levels who want to engage in EFS, and also have a location on our MDIC website for startups to go to for a network of sites that can offer a seamless transition from your EFS to pivotal IDE. And you can go to the next slide. And then just some of the current priority activities. As discussed, we want to leverage this success in structural heart, and we are currently doing work, obviously, in the neurovascular space, electrophysiology, heart failure, and then we hope to get more involved with non-cardiocentric therapeutic areas as well. And another initiative that Lauren is going to speak to more in a minute is MDIC is collaborating with the FDA to create risk-based strategies for the biocompatibility requirements in our EFS program. And we also have a strong commitment lying in the simplifying contract negotiations between sponsors and sites for efficient study launch. And currently, and we're also addressing potential barriers like CMS insurance coverage issues. And then, as is the reason for the webinar today, we want to proactively connect with the startup community and spread awareness about MDIC's resources to aid and guide in the medical device development journey. You can go to the next slide. And this just goes over everything I just said. You can skip over this slide. And then this slide just goes over a timeline, and I can send this out for reference. This all of the tools that MDIC and their volunteers have created. And I just want to touch base on the Master Clinical Trial Agreement for a second. So the MDIC approached attorneys, both from sites and sponsors, to discuss frequent key choke points in EFS contract negotiations. So indemnification, subject injury, intellectual property, third-party payer, just to name a few. And what they did over a weekend in person was develop an EFS-specific master clinical trial agreement. And this is to facilitate efficiencies in the EFS contracting process. And so this really was intended to offer a balance between sites and sponsors and provide about 90% of the agreement, leaving only about 10% for the legal team to focus on requiring their negotiation. Next slide. And so here's our contact information. This QR code will be presented at the end, but it's a link to all of the EFS Resource Hub and everything that you would need that we have created.
Thanks, Eileen. Why don't we, nice summary. Lauren, maybe we can tee you up next.
Sure, thanks. I think you're going to hear somewhat, I think we're pretty consistent thematically about interacting with FDA. That's sort of my key messaging here as well. I'm going to just touch on a few things that are particularly a specific focus that I've observed that are sort of special to neurovascular, a little bit, maybe a little bit different than cardiovascular. So first, next slide. The first one I'll point out is that there is somewhat of a unique aspect related to the simulated use benchtop model. And I've put a citation in here from the FDA guidance document. I've seen this be sort of a point of confusion between sponsors and FDA, but I think that there are anatomic models now that are readily available and commercially addressing the request from FDA for two 180-degree bends and two 360-degree bends when you're navigating on the neurovascular anatomy. I would strongly encourage you to use one of these models because there is sort of an expectation that if you're going to have navigation for things like flow diverters, or that you really do want to make sure that you're abiding by. This is actually a citation from the 510K guidance for the, not specific for EFS, but I think that this has been a consistent request from FDA. And we'll go to the next slide, which is another unique aspect. But this one is anybody that's been working in this space with FDA has seen that biocomp is a big source of confusion between sponsors and subject matter experts. 10993 testing is mandated, and the extent of that mandate is where I see the confusion. So be focused on your touch list and not just the materials that make up the product, but actually what the materials are and the exposure to materials during the manufacturing process. That is where I think there has been some sort of a rub between industry and FDA. I think it's definitely well explained by FDA, the concerns and the risks. And I think that, as Eileen mentioned, we're working, there's a separate working group now devoted to biocomp. I think it's well recognized as a limitation. that we're trying to overcome. The best approach is engaging with FDA early and often is what I say. You want to be transparent about what your approach is, what your product is intended to be used for, how to balance the risk to the benefit, and the exposure to this small population and how you can mitigate the risk that might be in play. Last point that I would highlight is on the next slide, and it is with regard to animals. Obviously, neuro is a very unique anatomic location. So we have available some very well-established animal models. In rabbits, the rabbit elastase model, I think anybody that's been in this space would know that that's a pretty well accepted model. Again, we need to balance what we do in animals with what we do in simulated use, and the materials and the exposure, the number of samples in an animal, the time frame for duration. It's all got to come into play in terms of how to craft the risk benefit to your presentation in the EFS construct. Again, don't do a ton of animals and then come to FDA, because that puts both of you in a very compromised position. FDA doesn't always want to, it's not a great place for either party to say, geez, you did these animals, but gosh, they didn't really give us enough information to really mitigate the risk. So it's an uncomfortable conversation. It's better to have this conversation and work through what the protocol should be before you do the animals. So with that, I think we're all saying the same thing. Engage with FDA. It allows you that opportunity, as Owen said, to educate FDA, educate your sites, learn more. And then also, as Adnan referred to, it's almost like you get an opportunity while you're collecting the clinical data to design your pivotal trial with input from FDA along the way. So with that, I'll leave it at that.
Thanks very much, Lauren. And I got one question for you in your final 3 minutes here, which is, what have you, we've just been talking about the US, but what have you observed has been a challenge, say, in the EU with the implementation of MDR for early stage clinical research?
Yeah,
different kinds of problems, I think. Yeah,
it's definitely different. I don't think that the same line of questioning exists. The MDR is impacting us quite a bit on obtaining a CE mark. The threshold for clinical research is a little bit longer, but the questions are they're very different. We don't see the same types of questions for biocomp, for instance.
And have you seen sponsors do a hybrid strategy where they have sites both in the US and in Europe, common protocol, and just sort of see who progresses faster?
Absolutely. And it may not be just Central Europe. It's for sure. I think it's a pretty consistent process that I do with my clients, is to go parallel path, engage with FDA, collect data outside the United States as well. And, South America is very, very hot in the neuro space. So there's a lot of activity in South America for first in human. Great.
I'm looking at the chat box, and you guys are extremely quiet. So any questions from the audience, or throw them up in the chat box?
Or come online and you can question as well. Again, just I wanted to reiterate what Eileen had said earlier, is that those master contracts are incredibly useful. In fact, one of the members of the team that worked on modifying the master contract for neuro studies was our university lawyer. And let me tell you, that process of getting him engaged and working directly with sponsors really created a very simple template that really facilitated us being able to do all the different studies we are doing, because we just keep going back with the same template, and you just modify a few terms, but you don't have to start from scratch every single time. So I think it's a great service from MDIC to use some of those templates for getting some of these studies started.
You know, the other thing I recall about that master clinical trial agreement was that, you know, the first version was done, you know, very cardiovascular focused, but we then did reconvene another group of folks that from the neurovascular field, and they went through it and concluded that, you know, basically it's not any different really between neurovascular and cardiovascular. So it could either, you know, can easily be extended into many other, you know, therapeutic categories without constraint.
Now, let me ask another question, and maybe this is best for Owen. Can part of an early feasibility study be done OUS?
So we don't regulate what's done OUS. So it's, you know, you don't need our permission to conduct an OUS study.
Yeah, no, but in the sense that could a site in an EFS study be an out of the an OUS study site, part of a EFS, but just a site, say in Toronto, or
sure. I mean, we only have oversight over the US component. So you know, there can be a parallel protocol for OUS sites. That's fine. We're happy to look at the data together. But in terms of our oversight and our approval, it's for the US component.
So that means you do draw a distinction between sites for pivotal versus sites for EFS, because pivotal trials frequently have OUS sites.
Same thing though. Same. It's not different. So you can have you certainly, there can be an OUS component of a study where, you know, we see that all the time.
Right.
But when we approve an IDE, it is for the US component. It is for a US patient, number of US patients, number of US sites.
Yeah, and okay, so no, US patients. That's the important thing, is that okay, so if you do an early feasibility, you could use the protocol in parallel somewhere else, but when you look at the data from your standpoint, you will consider the US data.
When we look at the data at the end, we're happy to look at all of the data. That's
Okay.
fine. But the IDE approval, our IDE approval is for the US component.
Okay.
You know, so, you know, we see data, you know, and you know, we'll want to know if you're coming in with the data from OUS sites, we'll want to make sure that the protocol was the same and the patients were the same, and, you know, the background treatments were, you know, we'll want to understand those differences, because there can be differences. But we're happy to look at the data, probably both separate and together. You know, we certainly understand multinational studies, but our IDE approval and our IDE oversight is for the US component of that study.
Great.
Any other thoughts, Lauren, on, you have extensive experience, you know, because a lot of these companies have parallel tracks, right? I mean, they're not putting all their eggs in one basket, and they have, you know, maybe planning to do some outside the US and some contemporaneously in the US. And obviously that dynamic is massively shifted over the last 10 years. From 10 years ago, there was no consideration of doing something here. Now, I think for a lot, you know, based on a large part by the work done by MDIC and CHIP and other champions of the EFS program, and Andy Farb and you and others, there's a growing body of knowledge that supports, hey, we should at least look at the US, but that's still a pendulum. So how do you see companies changing their strategy based on all these overtures?
Well, I think that most companies, I would say, do these in parallel in this phase. There's also the component about CMS coverage that ties into it too. This rule of 5 where CMS will cover the EFS once there's data from 5 subjects with a certain level of follow-up. And that has driven a lot of activity outside the United States preemptively, so that not only can you get not only can you get maybe sometimes a little bit ahead of the curve than in the US, but you also get the CMS coverage, which is important. So that has definitely impacted clients that I have starting in a place outside the US, but there's still engagement along the way, for sure.
What I've seen a lot of is, I mean, the old model was first in man outside the US, progress to a CE mark, conclude your CE mark, and use the CE mark to submit for the US pivotal basis. So now that's switched up to, you still do a first in man, try and get your, 5 to 10 patients, so you've got sufficient data for CMS, reimbursement support in that particular regard. But then you would do a feasibility study, and I think a lot of sponsors do, it's one feasibility study, it's, call it 15 patients, and to hedge the enrollment, because you never know quite sure who's going to enroll successfully, do 2 or 3 sites OUS, 2 or 3 sites US, and then let the logistics of the study dictate when the study is complete. When you've achieved 15 patients overall, you submit the entire pool of data to FDA, and then begin your pivotal. Typically using some of the pivotal data, your US pivotal with some fraction of EU sites to support the CE mark. And it's funny to watch now people obtain FDA approval early and then CE mark later as a result of the data sets evolving that way. So that's a pretty common approach, and I imagine it's going to evolve in the neurovascular space that way too.
There was a topic that you briefly touched upon, Lauren, and that was CMS. So the way I understand the rules, and please correct me if I'm wrong, the first 5 patients have to be covered by the company. But once you have treated 5 patients as part of an EFS, you can apply. It doesn't mean CMS will approve, but you can apply for the Category B IDE exemption. And I know this is really near and dear to your heart, Chip, because you've been really taking this aspect on quite a bit. So any insight there in terms of reimbursement, CMS and EFS?
So it's let me just comment that you don't apply for Category B, that the EFS de facto has been, and Owen can probably elaborate, that gets a Category A, and Category A allows you to be reimbursed for the procedure, not the device, but the procedure through CMS coverage. However, CMS has sort of a rule of thumb that they need some level of clinical data before they feel comfortable with granting that coverage. And you won't find it anywhere in a regulation. The 5, we anecdotally call it the rule of 5, but it's something that's been working. I've used it quite extensively with clients, and it is 5 subjects with some follow-up. In certain places, it's 90 days in certain indications, but and it is about 5. And I've also had 5 subjects that we've sent a submission in and it didn't get approved, but it was because there were complicating factors, device modifications along the way. So it's not a hard and fast rule, but it works. And that's why you can choose to do the cases in the US and pay for them, or most of my clients get those 5 subjects outside the US because it's a little more cost effective. It's very difficult in the United States to get sites to sign a contract with 0 CMS coverage. It's just difficult. You can do it, but it's a challenge.
Just to embellish a little bit more, and then we're almost out of time. So again, any questions, love to have you in this dialogue. But on the CMS, once you get the CMS letter that covers for that, that's not when the negotiations are over with the clinical sites, because depending on the study, if you have private payer patients and a mixture with CMS patients, this is where there's a rub between sponsors and sites on when they do the negotiations over who pays for complications. And private payers in general won't pay for complications. CMS says they will, but then you can get caught up in treating patients differently, and a lot of sites don't like that. So then you need to turn to either self-insurance or your insurance, your clinical trial insurance provider to sort of backstop the risk of who pays for complications. And we're trying to at MDIC trying to really simplify that so that doesn't become an obstacle to completing a clinical clinical site negotiation. Kind of come up to the top of the hour. Any final questions?
No,
I mean, I think one observation that I saw, just a quick comment, is that it looks like the neuro EFS numbers are some of the more significant numbers. Eventually, these EFSs are going to be coming to a decision point on whether to transition to a larger study. So I think this is something to keep the discussion going on, because that's going to be important if any of these products are going to make it to the marketplace at some later date.
Yeah, you just had to make sure that you pointed out that Neuro was leading cardiac.
I did. I had to say for Graham Zuckerman, Neuro was leading.
It's very exciting. I mean, I think it speaks volumes about the amount of innovation that's going on in the neuro space in general, right? And it's coming from both the industry sponsors as well as clinicians.
And I'll just note that we announced publicly that neuro is going to be our next focus area for the TPLC advisory program, which is also intended to support innovation and devote additional resources to highly engaged interaction.
That's super news.
I-
Nan, why don't we give you the final comments or summary?
Yeah,
people's time.
I would say before I bid everybody adieu, a question for you, Owen. There is now an increasing level of interest in the neuro space, particularly given the incredible effectiveness of thrombectomy for stroke. That's really the spearhead for this. That there was an era in the 90s and 2000s that we tried over 200 different neuroprotective agents, and none of them really panned out when we did those studies without drugs. And so I see this incredible EFS movement on the CDRH side. Is there something complementary on the CEDAR side?